August 4th, 1896. A 15-month-old boy named Hyman Goldman dies in a tenement on the Lower East Side. He'd been in America for 9 months. His family had crossed an ocean to get here, and the thing that killed him wasn't disease or hunger or violence. It was heat. Over the next 10 days, close to 1,500 people across New York City will die the same way, making this, by some historians' count, the deadliest urban heat disaster in American history. And here's what stopped me cold researching this. Almost nobody's heard of it. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how a heat wave became a mass casualty event, and why the man who ran toward it, chipping ice off blocks for children to suck on, would go on to become President of the United States. New York City, August 1896. Roughly 100,000 people are packed into the tenement blocks of the Lower East Side. 5, sometimes 6 people to a single room. No running water in most units, and buildings designed with almost no airflow because every inch of land was too valuable to waste on space between them. For 10 straight days, the temperature hits 90 degrees and higher. Humidity sits near 90%, and, this is the detail that actually matters most, it never drops below 70 at night. No relief, ever. I've built this reconstruction from newspaper archives of the period, the personal letters of Theodore Roosevelt, who was serving as New York's police commissioner that summer, and the reporting of Jacob Riis, whose 1890 investigation, How the Other Half Lives, had already documented these exact tenements 6 years earlier. Everything you see has been visually reconstructed with modern tools, guided by that research. We're going to follow this crisis day by day, block by block, because that's genuinely how it unfolded, slowly, then all at once. Quick thing before we go on. If you're the kind of person who wants history that's actually built from primary sources instead of vibes, that's what this channel does every week. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Okay, back to day 1, because right now, almost nobody in this city thinks this is an emergency yet. Day 1. The heat arrives. Here's what most people get wrong about heat waves as a historical disaster. There's no single dramatic moment. Day 1 just feels like a hot day. The tenement blocks between the East River and the Bowery are 5 and 6 stories tall, built wall to wall with almost no gap between buildings, which means the brick itself soaks up heat all day and radiates it back out all night. Like the whole neighborhood is a low, slow oven that never turns off. According to housing surveys from this exact period, a typical Lower East Side tenement room measured roughly 10 by 12 feet and might house an entire family. Plus, this detail genuinely surprised me, a boarder or two renting floor space, because every square foot that wasn't generating rent was money lost. My take? This wasn't overcrowding by accident. It was overcrowding by design. A direct financial incentive built into how these buildings were owned and rented. And it's exactly what turned an uncomfortable week into a catastrophe. Picture the actual air in one of these rooms. Most tenement buildings from this era had windows only on the front and back of the structure. Interior rooms, the ones deepest inside the building, often had no direct outside window at all, just a narrow air shaft shared with the building next door, more useful for carrying cooking smells and other tenants' voices than for moving any real air. Add the smell of the streets below, horse manure, garbage that wouldn't be collected for days, the East River itself running close by. And even opening what windows you had wasn't necessarily relief. Cooking still happened on coal or wood stoves, because that's what people had, which meant the one appliance capable of making a hot room hotter got used 3 times a day anyway, because everyone still had to eat. Day 2 to 4. Who could leave and who couldn't? By day 2 or 3, the city splits cleanly along a line that has nothing to do with the weather itself. Wealthier New Yorkers who could afford it had largely already left for the Jersey Shore, the Catskills, or Long Island before the worst of the heat even arrived. That was simply the summer rhythm of anyone with money in 1896. The people who stayed were the people who had no choice. Garment workers, pushcart vendors, day laborers, many of them recent Jewish, Italian, and Slavic immigrants who couldn't leave their jobs even for a day, let alone a week, without risking the income their families needed to eat. Picture what that actually meant, hour to hour. A laborer working outdoors, paving streets, hauling freight, through the hottest part of an August afternoon, in wool trousers, because that's what work clothes were, then walking home to a room that was, if anything, hotter than the street outside. According to Roosevelt's own letters from that week, horses working the streets started dying by the hundreds, collapsing where they stood, and the city couldn't remove the carcasses fast enough. He described the smell in the streets as having, in his words, a genuine flavor of pestilence. Roosevelt himself, in the same letter to his sister, wrote that the death rate had roughly tripled, approaching what he compared to the ratio of a cholera epidemic, from a man who wasn't prone to exaggeration in his official correspondence. That comparison alone tells you how the crisis actually felt to people living through it in real time. And this was happening in a city with essentially no public health infrastructure built for exactly this kind of slow, grinding emergency. Fire departments and police could respond to a building collapse or a fire in hours. Nobody had a plan for a threat that simply kept building, day after identical day, with no single moment that obviously demanded action. Day 5. The rooftops. By around day 5, something specific starts happening across the tenement districts that I think is the single most human detail in this whole story. People start sleeping on their rooftops, not as a novelty, as a survival strategy, because the roof was often the only place in the building that got any air movement at all. Newspaper accounts from the period describe entire families dragging mattresses, blankets, and sometimes just bed sheets up narrow tenement stairwells to spend the night under open sky, packed shoulder to shoulder with their neighbors doing exactly the same thing. Here's the part that turned this from uncomfortable into genuinely dangerous. Those rooftops had no railings built for this purpose. They were flat roofs, meant for laundry lines and water tanks, not for sleeping families. According to newspaper reports from that week, several people, some of them children, rolled off in their sleep and fell to their deaths. Others tried the East River piers instead, looking for a breeze off the water, and drowned after dozing off too close to the edge. This is the fact most people never hear about this heat wave. Some of the deaths weren't from heat stroke directly. They were people desperately improvising shelter that the city had never provided, and paying for it with their lives. Think about the actual scene up there for a second, because it's not what you'd picture from a modern rooftop. No string lights, no lounge chairs, just tar paper, chimney stacks, laundry lines strung between buildings, and dozens of exhausted families lying close enough to hear each other breathing. Some accounts from the period describe entire blocks essentially relocating upward after dark, so that by midnight, the rooftops held almost as many people as the apartments below them did during the day. It was, in its own way, a form of community. Neighbors who might barely speak during a normal week suddenly sharing the only livable square footage the city had left them. The ice monopoly. And here's the fact that reframes this whole disaster, because it's not really a story about weather. It's a story about a monopoly. Ice in 1896 New York wasn't cheap and widely available the way we'd assume. It was controlled by what was effectively an ice trust, a small group of companies that controlled supply and kept prices high, especially in poorer neighborhoods where competition was thin. A tenement family desperate to cool a room, preserve food, or bring down a sick child's fever might simply not be able to afford it at the exact moment they needed it most. Most videos about this kind of tragedy go straight for outrage at this point. I want to slow down instead, because the actual response is more interesting than blind cruelty. Theodore Roosevelt, as police commissioner, started personally soliciting donations from wealthy New Yorkers he knew socially, and used that money to buy ice wholesale and distribute it for free from police station houses across the poorest precincts. Historians studying his letters note this was effectively the first systematic public cooling response in American urban history. Nothing like it had existed before. He also toured the tenements himself with Jacob Riis during the crisis, and reportedly watched fathers chip slivers of ice off blocks so their children could suck on them, since there was nothing else to give them. There's a specific reason ice mattered so much beyond simple cooling, and it's worth spelling out. Without refrigeration, milk spoiled within hours in this heat, and spoiled milk was one of the biggest killers of infants in tenement districts, even in a normal summer. This heat wave just compressed that risk into days instead of weeks. Riis had already documented 6 years earlier in his own investigation families relying on milk peddled from open carts that had often sat unrefrigerated for hours before it ever reached a tenement kitchen. Free ice wasn't just comfort. In the middle of an August like this one, for a family with an infant, it was closer to a direct intervention against one specific, well-understood cause of death. The city finally reacts. By day 8 or 9, city officials still hadn't called an emergency meeting. According to reporting from that week, the mayor didn't convene his department heads until the very end of the crisis, once the death toll had already climbed for over a week. When action finally came, it was almost startlingly simple. The Department of Public Works shifted outdoor laborers to work at night and early morning instead of through the hottest afternoon hours. And on the final day, officials authorized opening fire hydrants across the densest neighborhoods so residents could cool themselves and the streets directly with the water. If you've ever seen the classic image of kids playing in an open fire hydrant on a hot city block, this crisis is arguably where that now familiar scene starts. Why did it take so long? Because in 1896, there was no real precedent, and frankly, no real expectation that city government owed the poor any kind of coordinated disaster response. Roosevelt's improvised ice distribution was closer to charity than policy. The formal machinery for something like this simply didn't exist yet. It's also worth saying plainly, Roosevelt's ice campaign, as significant as it was, reached a fraction of the people who needed it. He was one police commissioner, funding relief through personal appeals to wealthy friends, in a city of well over 1 million people. Historians still debate how much credit he deserves versus how much the moment simply happened to find him. He was already known for walking Lower East Side beats personally, and had already read Riis's work before the heat wave ever hit. What's not in dispute is that this crisis visibly changed how he talked and wrote about poverty for the rest of his political career. By the time the heat finally broke, the toll had landed almost entirely on one part of the population. According to mortality records from the period, the dead were overwhelmingly infants, small children, and elderly residents in the poorest tenement blocks, bodies least able to handle extended heat stress, living in exactly the conditions least equipped to relieve it. Death certificates from the week frequently list causes like cholera infantum or heat prostration in infants who, weeks earlier, might have survived a milder summer entirely. Some historians put the final toll closer to 1,300, others closer to 1,500. The exact number is genuinely disputed, because heat deaths in this era were often recorded under other listed causes, meaning the true toll may never be fully known. What made this specific population so vulnerable wasn't just biology, though that mattered too. Infants and the elderly genuinely struggle more to regulate body temperature under sustained heat stress. It was that vulnerability stacked directly on top of poverty in a way that multiplied the danger. A wealthier infant with a fever had a family doctor, iced drinks, a home with cross-ventilation, maybe a country house to retreat to. A tenement infant in the same condition had none of those options simultaneously in the same city during the exact same 10 days. The disease was the same, the outcome wasn't. So what actually happened here, underneath the numbers? Not a natural disaster in the pure sense. A heat wave met a city that had built entire neighborhoods with no margin for it, no airflow, no affordable cooling, no emergency plan, and a monopoly controlling the one resource that might have saved the most vulnerable people first. What strikes me most, looking back at this with everything we now know about heat as a genuine public health threat, is how directly this 10-day crisis in 1896 previews conversations cities are still having today. The specific technology has changed. The basic problem, who gets to escape the heat and who doesn't, really hasn't. Would you have known to move to the roof? Would you have known it was dangerous to? Tell me honestly in the comments. And if this pulled you in, the video I'd point you to next goes inside one of these exact tenement buildings on an ordinary, non-crisis day. Because understanding how people lived here every single summer makes it a lot clearer why this particular week turned deadly. Subscribe if you want to see that one when it drops.